In Flint Creek in 1884, a ranch wasn't seized with guns, but with silent drops of black ink. Nate Wynn, the proud rancher struggling against the harsh winter, was unaware that 2,500 acres of his family's blood and flesh heritage had been sent to the gallows. The red-painted wooden stakes secretly planted on the Flint Spur border were a death sentence, a cruel trap waiting to strangle the entire Wynn family. The ranch's only glimmer of hope now lay in the hands of the person Nate most wanted to get rid of, Ada Blake, a city widow considered by the town to be a weak, insignificant minor. With just a signature of the transfer of ownership, Ada would have a large fortune to safely leave this desolate land, leaving her stubborn brother-in-law to sink deeper into deception. Why would a despised woman risk her life for a family that always wanted to reject her? But just as the darkness of the conspiracy threatened to engulf everything, Ada made an irreversible choice. She coldly pushed the bribe money aside, tossed the tattered ledger of forged numbers onto the table, and single-handedly ignited a fierce battle to protect a home that had never truly welcomed her. The atmosphere on Ada Blake's first night at Wynn Creek Ranch was colder than the howling north wind across the pasture. Nate Wynn, her brother-in-law, whom she had only met a few times, wasn't there to greet her. He was struggling in the darkness with a broken section of fence. Left alone in the kitchen, still bearing the marks of her late husband, an old coat on the hook, a thin book of poetry lying silently, Ada happened to see the ranch ledger open. Her cautious nature, typical of a banker's daughter, drew her attention to 3 feed bills lying askew inside. The same quantity of feed, the same delivery route, yet the price had inexplicably increased month after month, and in the corner of one bill, the words FS option were scrawled suggestively. Ada realized immediately the farm wasn't suffering from bad weather or misfortune, but was being deliberately manipulated from within. The wooden door was suddenly kicked open, and Nate entered, his shoulders covered in dust and the biting cold of the frontier. Seeing his city-dwelling sister-in-law scrutinizing the family ledger, Nate's eyes flashed with the anger and defensiveness of a proud man. He was convinced she was just a curious stranger, arriving only to try and appraise the remaining Wynn estate for cash. But instead of backing down from his hostility, Ada calmly placed the bill on the table, her voice quiet but sharp as a knife. "You're not losing this ranch because of bad land, Mr. Wynn. You're losing it because someone knows you never bother to read these numbers." The next morning, under the gray Kansas sky, Nate made a straightforward offer. He wanted to pay a fair price to buy out a quarter of Ada's shares, hoping to send her back to Kansas City on the earliest possible train. In Nate's mind, Wynn Creek was his flesh and blood, a land his father had pioneered, a land he swore to protect at all costs. And a frail widow had absolutely no right to judge or interfere. But Nate had mistakenly touched upon the wound and pride of the woman sitting opposite him. After her husband's death, Ada's family in the city forced her to live like a silent shadow, and she came to Flint Creek not for bailout money, but to reclaim her right to decide her own life. She looked directly at Nate, brushed aside the agreement, and coldly reminded him that legally she worked under the name Ada Blake, not as an attachment to his brother. Her uncompromising confrontation stunned the stubborn rancher, making him realize that this woman was not as fragile as she appeared. Before Nate could retort, Ada concluded the conversation with an unshakable decision. "My father taught me one thing, Mr. Wynn. Never sell something you haven't inspected yourself. "Get the horses ready. I want to go out and see the Flint Spur estate you're leaving vacant." Nate reluctantly saddled his horse and led his stubborn sister-in-law toward Flint Spur, secretly hoping the harshness of the prairie would break the will of a city flower. They passed stretches of parched grassland, patched up barbed wire fences, and a few emaciated cows standing alone by shallow puddles. Nate knew this land intimately by sight, by the ruts of ox cart wheels and the footprints etched in the frost. But when Ada spoke, her questions were as sharp as knives. How much does it cost to keep this fence in place? How many cows actually survive on this withered grass? How much does feed cost to compensate for the shortage? The weathered rancher fell silent. He had no numbers to answer. Ada wasn't mocking Nate's experience. She was cruelly exposing the truth. He was using the blood of fertile land to nourish barren land, and justifying it as loyalty to his deceased father. Ada's horse suddenly slipped as it crossed a dry ditch, and Nate instinctively reached out to catch her. But the woman didn't panic or seek pity. She straightened herself, calmly adjusted her dusty gloves, and continued to gaze ahead. In that moment, Nate's initial aversion began to crack, giving way to a quiet respect for her remarkable perseverance. But as the north wind howled again, Ada's sharp gaze suddenly settled on the edge of Flint Spur. Amidst the withered grass, a brand new wooden stake painted a bright red was driven deep into the ground. Nate frowned. He knew every stone on this farm, and he swore he had never personally driven that strange stake. That night, under the flickering kitchen lamp, the accounting battle truly reached its peak. Ada exposed the rotten flaws gnawing away at Wynn Creek. Constantly inflated feed prices, delivery invoices lacking proper warehouse receipts, and two frail old cattle herders receiving their full wages despite being too weak to lift a roll of barbed wire. Nate's anger flared, for to him, the feed supplier, Amos Reed, was a benefactor who had saved the farm during a drought, and those two old men were like brothers who had fought alongside his father through thick and thin. He roared, accusing Ada of using the soulless numbers of the tycoons to trample on the honor and humanity of the frontier. But Ada didn't raise her voice. She simply threw back a cold truth. Honor doesn't lie in being deceived. She didn't tell him to throw the old employees out on the street, but suggested paying them a decent pension instead of blindly letting unscrupulous merchants exploit his compassion to plunder his fortune. Silence enveloped the kitchen. Nate was shocked to realize that the very pride he had always fought for was the very thing that was dragging his family's hard work to the grave. Just as the American man's defenses crumbled, Ada turned to the last page of the ledger. A crumpled receipt accidentally slipped out from the worn pages. Beneath the familiar signature of the delivery man, Amos Reed, a hastily written but haunting initials read S. Kerr. Silas Kerr appeared at Wynn Creek on a gloomy morning, sporting the deceptive politeness of a railroad agent. A clean coat, mud-free leather shoes, and a calculating smile. He didn't threaten with guns, but with soft, velvety words to strangle his prey. Silas subtly brought up Nate's ballooning feed debt, the harsh winter approaching, and then offered a humane lifeline. A purchase of the barren Flint Spur land for a price just enough to clear the debt. Nate stood with his arms crossed on the porch, his pride pushed to the wall, almost nodding in agreement to protect the honor of someone who never defaulted on a debt. But in the corner of the room, Ada didn't say a word to intervene. She simply glanced silently at the tiny print on the contract. Her cold, sharp eyes quickly revealed the truth. This contract wasn't just about buying land. It deprived him of the right to build a railway, control the water supply, and monopolize the entire vital wagon route for the farm. If he signed, Nate wouldn't just lose a strip of bad land. He would be handing over the very throat of Wynn Creek to the railroad capitalists. Nate looked at Ada, and for the first time in his life, the proud farm owner chose to swallow his anger, refusing to sign and politely dismissing the uninvited guests. As Silas Kerr's carriage turned and left the dusty yard, he hissed through clenched teeth, whispering into his accomplice Amos Reed's ear. "If that widow stays on this farm for more than 3 days, we'll never get Flint Spur for this paltry price." As soon as the enemy's figure disappeared behind the trees, Nate and Ada immediately spurred their horses and galloped toward the Flint Spur border. The howling north wind carried a biting chill, but it couldn't extinguish the truth that was gradually emerging from the old map Joel had left behind. Ada spread the map flat on her horse's back, carefully comparing each coordinate with the red-painted wooden stakes scattered across the meadow. The truth was finally revealed. Those stakes didn't belong to the farm. They marked the exact route of the planned railroad crossing that would cut through Flint Creek. The FS option on the bill wasn't a coincidence. It was a sinister plot between the hay dealer and the railroad agent to squeeze Nate's finances dry, forcing him to sell his strategic land cheaply before the railroad project was announced. At that fateful turning point, everything was completely turned upside down. Ada realized she couldn't simply appraise the shares and walk away, leaving her husband's legacy to be devoured by vultures. And Nate, the man who had once looked at her with contempt, now realized with shock how blind he had been to only use brute force to protect the land. He turned to look at the small but resilient woman before him, lowering his proud ego and asking a question he never thought he would utter. If this were your ledger, what would you do? Under the swirling dark clouds, Ada rolled up the map, her eyes shining with unwavering determination. "I wouldn't sell the land. I would sell what the railroad needs, and keep the part of the farm that we can't afford to lose." Ada refused to let fear overwhelm her, quickly devising a plan that would turn the tables on Silas Kerr and his men, something they never anticipated. Instead of selling the entire Flint Spur estate, she proposed negotiating a narrow land use right for the railroad, requiring them to pay toll fees while the ranch retained its pasture and vital water source. But a perfect plan on paper would be worthless without the life or death understanding of a man who belonged to this land. Nate stepped forward, brushed the dust off the table, and added the crucial pieces. He knew exactly which high ground the railroad had to run through to avoid spring floods, and which sections were most prone to collapse. The combination of Ada's cold, calculating numbers and Nate's wild instincts transformed Flint Spur from a barren strip of land into a strategic gold mine that capitalists craved. They officially became true partners. Ada took the ledger of debts and fraudulent documents, while Nate took the reins, scrutinizing the workers and every inch of the fence. That afternoon, standing before the skeptical cowboys, Nate boldly declared a statement that carried more weight than any solemn vow. "From today, Mrs. Blake's accounts are as important as my word. Anyone who disagrees, take your wages and leave before sunset." That was the absolute guarantee of honor the proud man from the West bestowed upon her. But the enemy's retaliation came faster than they expected. That very night, the lock on the barn containing the animal feed was smashed, and half of the best hay sacks had vanished without a trace. The next morning, a despicable psychological attack spread throughout Flint Creek, aiming to stifle Ada's will. The hay supplier, Amos Reed, spread rumors that the Wynn widow was actually a money-hungry woman who had come to sell the ranch to the railroad. Suspicious glances began to fall upon her, and venomous whispers arose from the townswomen, mocking the shamelessness of a widow living under the same roof as her late husband's brother. Silas Kerr, more cunning, understood that he couldn't intimidate Nate with guns, so he chose to isolate Ada's honor in order to break the nascent alliance. He secretly sought her out, offering a huge sum of money to buy back a quarter of the shares, creating a perfect escape route for her to return to Kansas City in glory. Nate knew the humiliating rumors were tearing at his sister-in-law's honor, but he gritted his teeth and remained silent, not forcing her to stay. He understood that if she chose to leave, it wouldn't be a betrayal, but if she stayed, she would suffer the humiliation of a farm teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. But both Silas Kerr and Nate Wynn underestimated the pride of a banker's daughter. Ada coldly refused the dirty money from the railroad agent, offered no explanation to the public, and quietly returned to the kitchen table, burying herself in the messy pile of ledgers. Watching the oil lamp burn brightly through the window from afar, Nate silently understood that the woman had dispelled all doubts with her life or death choice, and that perseverance had been richly rewarded. In the dead of night, Ada's fingers froze over a half-torn bill. Amos Reed had brazenly charged Wynn Creek for food on the very day his wagons were unloading at the railroad depot. Just as the light of truth began to emerge, the darkness of suspicion cruelly descended upon Wynn Creek Farm. While cleaning out his late brother's oak coffin, Nate stumbled upon a crumpled, ink-stained letter with a cryptic message. "If you ever come to Wynn Creek, look carefully at Flint Spur." The blindness of a man cornered led Nate to completely misinterpret the sacred meaning. His rage flared up like fire. He slammed the letter onto the kitchen table, bitterly accusing Ada of knowing the land's value beforehand and coming here to set a cruel trap for his family. But Nate didn't know that Ada never had the courage to read the final lines of her husband's letter because the pain of her loss was still too sharp. The cruel suspicion of her brother-in-law was like a knife cutting through a nascent bond, reminding her that, in the eyes of this proud man, she would forever remain a money-hungry outsider. At the same time, the enemy's encirclement tightened. Amos Reed immediately cut off the supply of winter hay, demanded payment that very night, and Silas Kerr sent an ultimatum forcing her to sign the contract before dawn. Without shedding a tear or begging for mercy, Ada silently placed Joel's letter, the ledger, and the map on the table. She slowly closed her trunk, calmly saying, "You may doubt me, Mr. Wynn, but please don't doubt what Joel risked his life to leave you." But just as the widow was about to leave, a cowherd's frantic scream ripped through the night. The north wind had shifted, and the cattle were being driven straight toward the shallow fence at Flint Spur. The blue northern storm raged across the Kansas prairie like a bloodthirsty monster, bringing with it a deadly cold that froze everything in an instant. Hundreds of cattle, in a panic, trampled over each other, drifting toward the Flint Spur boundary where a deep gorge loomed, threatening to swallow the entire farm's livelihood. Nate mounted his horse in the pitch-black night, desperately herding the cattle along the familiar trail, unaware that the storm had turned it into a deadly swamp. Standing on the brink of staying or leaving, Ada tossed her suitcase aside, grabbed the map, lit the storm lamp, and charged straight into the heart of the hurricane. She rode her horse to block the cattle, brandishing her bright lamp against the swirling snow, shouting for Nate to steer the herd toward higher ground near the railroad posts. Amidst the howling wind and the terrified roars of the animals, Nate stared in stunned silence at the woman he had just driven away, now risking her own life to save his ranch. The American man gritted his teeth, casting aside his inherent pride, choosing to place the entire fate of Wynn Creek in her map-wielding hands. They plunged into battle with a wordless understanding. Nate used pliers to cut through the barbed wire, while Ada gripped the reins tightly, holding her lamp aloft to guide their way. When the last cow escaped the clutches of death, Nate collapsed in the snow, looking up at Ada's pale yet proud face. He finally understood that honor wasn't about words, but about standing shoulder to shoulder on the brink of life and death. But as the first faint rays of dawn shone on the snow, another chilling truth was revealed. The dilapidated fence that had driven the cows to their deaths the previous night hadn't been knocked down by the storm. On the rusted barbed wire, fresh pliers still bore the marks of the pliers. As dawn broke, dispelling the snowstorm, Nate and Ada entered Flint Creek, not with loaded Colts, but with a far more devastating weapon: the truth. They burst through the sheriff's office with a banker, the railroad agent Silas Kerr, and the con artist Amos Reed were calmly awaiting a land deal. Without a scream, Ada calmly poured cold water on their complacency by flattening the ledger pages on the wooden desk. She exposed their rotten schemes: inflated invoices, forged delivery dates, forged signatures, and the hidden water monopoly clause in the contract that Silas had used to trap them. Silas hissed, trying to salvage some of his tattered honor by humiliating Ada, loudly accusing her of being nothing more than a money-grubbing widow, fabricating evidence to steal the Wynn family fortune. But Nate slammed the rusty bundle of barbed wire, its snips still fresh from the pliers, onto the floor, silencing any further excuses. In front of the most powerful men in town, the proud rancher gritted his teeth, casting aside his pride, and boldly admitted he had been blind to the numbers. Nate stepped forward to shield Ada, roaring a statement that slapped the vultures in the face. "Mrs. Blake didn't come here to steal my ranch. She came to stop me from handing it over to the scum who deceived me." Completely exposed, Silas Kerr couldn't force the purchase of Flint Spur without Ada's signature proving ownership of a quarter of the shares. Ada coldly delivered her final verdict. Wynn Creek would not sell the land. They would only be allowed to lease a limited right to use the rail tracks at a price she would determine. Knowing he had lost the financial game, Silas stomped out the door, but not without throwing back a sarcastic question. "So what are you going to do with your quarter of the shares, Mrs. Wynn?" The storm had passed, the enemy had retreated, and Ada Blake understood that her mission at Wynn Creek was complete. She packed her bags, and for the first time, the carriage ride to Flint Creek Station was no longer stifled by hostile silence. Nate didn't beg her to stay, for he understood that love wasn't about using vulnerability to bind a free woman. Standing on the windy platform, he gently touched the brim of his hat, promising to buy back her shares at the fairest price possible, and absolutely never to call her departure a betrayal. The train whistle shrieked, tearing through the air. Ada watched the massive iron machine approaching, then looked down at the wooden trunk containing her entire life. She remembered her father's teachings and slowly turned to look at the stern man standing before her. "I checked the land. I checked the livestock, I checked the ledgers, and I also checked the man trying to hold on to all of it." Ada's lips curved into a determined smile. "I won't sell my share, Nate." No sentimental declarations were uttered. Nate simply walked silently, lifted Ada's heavy trunk off the platform, and tossed it back into the carriage. Months later, Flint Spur was not lost. Ada's shrewd franchise deal had provided the cash flow for Wynn Creek to pay decent pensions to its old cattle ranchers and revitalize the entire business. On another cold, windy night, Ada sat under the quiet kitchen lamp, but this time Nate entered and placed his mud-stained glove beside the ledger. "You read this land with ink. I read it with dust," Nate smiled softly. "Perhaps this farm truly needs both." Ada closed the ledger, her gaze drifting out the window toward the twinkling train lights on the horizon. Right here at this table, under this flickering lamplight, the numbers that once held the death sentence for Wynn Creek now silently sang the song of rebirth. There are battles that don't begin with gunfire, yet demand more courage than any duel on the prairie. Ada and Nate have shown us that blind loyalty to the past is not honorable. True honor lies in daring to face the harsh truth, daring to let go of pride and ego, and standing shoulder to shoulder to protect what is most valuable. Thank you for stopping by and joining Wynn Creek Ranch on today's story of survival and love in the Wild West. If you were in Ada's situation, would you be willing to risk your safety and honor for a home that never truly welcomed you? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We're always eager to hear your perspective. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next nostalgic and emotional journeys. Gunfire may dissipate, storms may cease, but the legends of love and resilience in the frontier will live on. Goodbye, and see you in the next towns.